You touched the one place they buried, and that's why they ran. They didn't leave because you overwhelmed them. They left because, for a moment, they saw a version of themselves in your eyes. And it terrified them. Not the version they perform for the world. Not the one they spent years crafting through pain and pretense. But the raw one, the hidden one, the part they buried so deeply, they convinced even themselves it never existed. You didn't know. How could you? You were simply loving them. Gently, consistently, without a hidden agenda. But what you didn't realize is this. Some people carry shame like skin. It's not just something they feel. It's something they are. It becomes woven into their identity, their wiring, their breath. When you held them in compassion, they didn't feel embraced. They felt exposed. You reached toward a part of them they promised would never see daylight again. Not because it didn't deserve love, but because it once asked for love and was abandoned anyway. They made a vow in silence. Maybe it was years ago, during a childhood that taught them closeness equals danger, or a relationship where vulnerability became a weapon. At some point, they decided it was safer to hide that part of themselves than to ever risk it being rejected again. And here you came, not demanding, not threatening, just being present, warm, unflinching. You didn't pry, but your consistency was louder than any question. You didn't interrogate, but your attention made them feel seen. You didn't pressure, but your care whispered. You don't have to carry that alone anymore. And that's when panic set in. Because when someone has survived for years, by avoiding their own reflection, what do you think happens when they finally catch a glimpse? Their nervous system doesn't say, "Wow, I'm healing." It says, "Run." Run from the one who sees through you. Run from the person who touches you in places no one has ever reached. Run before they get close enough to confirm what you feared your whole life. That if someone saw the real you, they'd leave too. The irony? You never intended to expose anything. You just wanted to love them. But to someone who's built a survival identity on being untouchable, even softness can feel like a threat. You see, people bury what hurts, and then they protect the burial site with stories. I don't need anyone. I'm better off alone. No one would understand anyway. Vulnerability is weakness, but every time you were honest, every time you listened without judgment, loved without condition, you unknowingly brought a shovel to the site. And what they saw rising to the surface wasn't just old pain. It was their entire emotional history screaming, "Don't let this happen again." They wanted connection, but not at the cost of being known. They wanted intimacy, but not if it meant facing the part of themselves they learned to numb. And the part you touched? It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, still, sacred. It was the tender part, the version of themselves that still grieves, not for what happened, but for who they had to become in order to survive it. You didn't threaten their ego. You threatened their defense system. They may have spent years appearing strong, the achiever, the stoic one, the emotionally unbothered. But beneath the calm exterior was someone still frozen in a moment they never got to process. And when you made space for them, without asking anything in return, they saw the truth. If I allow myself to be this open, I might lose control of everything I've worked so hard to keep together. That's when the subconscious kicks in. The distancing, the pulling back, the sudden silence, and then the disappearance. They ghosted not to punish you, but to preserve the fragile reality they'd built for themselves. A reality that told them, if I feel too deeply, I'll fall apart. If I let anyone that close, they'll destroy me. So they left, not because of you, but because of what you stirred awake. And what hurts most, you were never trying to dig anything up. You were just loving them in a way that felt different from the survival they've known. Different, not because it was wrong, but because it was real. Real feels dangerous to someone who only knows performative safety. Because if it's real, then it can be really lost. And that's the most terrifying possibility of all. When safe love feels like a threat, they didn't flee the love you gave them. They fled the feeling of safety that love created. Because safety was never safe for them. That sounds strange, doesn't it? But for people who have lived in emotional survival mode, true safety feels foreign. And foreign can feel dangerous. You offered peace. They felt panic. You offered depth. They felt drowning. Why? Because when someone has normalized chaos, peace becomes uncomfortable. They're used to anticipating emotional explosions. Not calm, not softness, not stability. They've learned to scan for danger in every interaction. A pause in conversation must be disapproval. A delay in a text, they're being abandoned. A moment of vulnerability, they've just made a mistake they'll regret. You didn't know that your gentleness was setting off every internal alarm they've wired into their nervous system. Alarms that say, don't trust this, don't relax, don't believe in this. It won't last. It's not that they didn't want to trust you. They just didn't know how to. Imagine this. You've spent your entire life walking barefoot on shards of glass, learning exactly where to step to avoid being cut. Then one day, someone places you in a room full of soft cushions and says, rest here. You're safe now. Do you immediately lie down and relax? No. You freeze. You scan for the trap. You wonder, what do they really want from me? Because survival teaches suspicion, and suspicion teaches distance. When you love them without games, you disrupted a story they've lived by for years. That love always has a price. That kindness is always transactional. That connection is always temporary. To receive love without demand, without drama, without manipulation, that's not soothing to someone with avoidant patterns. That's suspicious. They don't trust stillness. Because the last time they relaxed, something crashed. The last time they opened up, someone used it against them. The last time they hoped, they were humiliated. So they built their own safety. Walls, distance, disengagement, hyper-independence. And you bypassed the front gate. Not by manipulation, but through consistency. You didn't try to fix them. You just stayed, and stayed, and stayed. And over time, that scared them more than any betrayal ever could. Because now there was something to lose. Now they cared. Now they were vulnerable again. And for them, vulnerability isn't about being open. It's about being in danger. So when they began to feel real affection for you, they ran, not to hurt you, but to survive themselves. People with avoidant tendencies often look emotionally cold, distant, unreachable. But underneath all that aloofness is usually one thing: fear, the terror of being known and found lacking. They've convinced themselves that no one would accept the real them, because somewhere in their early story, someone didn't. So they create a version of themselves they think is more acceptable, charming but detached, capable but cold, reliable but unfeeling. But then someone like you enters their life, not impressed by the performance, not intimidated by the silence. You're not playing the game. You see through it, not in a confrontational way, but in a deeply human one. You respond to their distance with patience, to their avoidance with understanding, to their defenses with tenderness. And in doing so, you start to unearth the truth, the parts of them they left behind in order to survive. They told themselves they were just independent, that they didn't need connection, that they were better alone. But you reminded them of something they didn't know they still longed for: to be met, fully, without shame. And that longing, it was more terrifying than anything else, because longing makes them feel powerless, and powerlessness, for them, is the beginning of collapse. So they retreat, not because you're wrong for them, but because you're right in a way they don't yet know how to accept. And maybe that's the heartbreak, that you didn't just love them, you saw them, and instead of leaning into it, they vanished. But here's what you must remember. They didn't run because you were too much. They ran because you were true. And truth, for someone who's built their life around avoidance, is the most intimate, disarming, and dangerous thing of all. The secret buried in their silence. Their silence isn't empty. It's not blank space. It's not the absence of feeling. It's full of unspoken things. Memories they don't revisit. Questions they've never dared to answer. Shame they haven't named out loud. You thought they ghosted you. You thought the connection vanished. But the truth is, they never stopped thinking about you. What they did was retreat. Into themselves. Into the old familiar cave, where nothing touches them, and no one really sees them. Not because they wanted to forget you, but because remembering you hurt too much. Avoidance often look like they're fine after they leave, like nothing ever happened, like it meant more to you than it did to them. But the story they tell themselves is not the same story they live with in silence. They tell themselves, I didn't care that much. It was too intense anyway. I didn't need them, but they do need. And that's what terrifies them, because needing someone means risking loss. And that's a risk they've trained their whole nervous system to avoid. So they bury it. The conversations you had, the way you looked at them when they weren't performing, the steadiness in your voice, the way you said I see you, without even needing words. All of it is still there, just beneath the surface, just under the skin. And when they lie awake at night, after the distractions wear off, when the room is quiet, and no one's asking anything of them, that's when your memory returns. It doesn't shout. It whispers. Your laugh, your questions, your quiet strength when they pushed you away. And you didn't react with drama, but with dignity. That's the part that wrecks them. Not your love, but your dignity. Because it held a mirror to their fear and showed them what they ran from. They didn't ghost you because they hated you. They ghosted because staying meant having to confront all the parts of themselves they didn't feel ready to meet. You weren't just another person. You were a mirror. And looking into you meant seeing themselves. That's what they buried. Not just the relationship, but what it revealed. Avoidance carries a secret. That deep down, they're not sure they're worthy of being loved as they are. So they build strategies. Control, distance, overachievement, sarcasm, withholding. But love, real love, asks them to drop the performance. And that's terrifying, because they're afraid if they strip it all back, you'll find someone unworthy underneath. But you didn't. You never did. You saw the fear and still leaned in. You noticed the flinch and didn't take it personally. You held space, even when they offered you nothing but walls. And in that space, they felt something they hadn't felt in years. If ever, they felt known, not admired, not desired, known. And for them, that's the most dangerous intimacy of all. Because if someone knows you, they can leave you for the truth of who you are. But you didn't leave. You waited until they did. They didn't slam a door. They didn't throw words at you. They just vanished. But their disappearance wasn't apathy. It was overwhelm. Their silence is not a statement of strength. It's a symptom of emotional flooding. They want to say, I miss you. I'm sorry I got scared. You were the first person who felt real to me. But saying those things would mean peeling back the armor. And they don't know who they are without it. So they stay quiet. They distract themselves. They keep scrolling, keep working, keep flirting with people who don't see them deeply. Because deep feels like danger, and shallow feels like control. But they remember you, even if they never say it, even if they never come back, even if the silence never breaks. Because some echoes are louder than noise, and the echo you left in them of real, steady, human connection doesn't fade. They just bury it, the same way they buried all the other truths that ever made them feel alive. But here's what they didn't expect: that someone like you would walk away without chasing, that you'd honor yourself without resentment, that you'd carry your love with grace, but not with self-abandonment. That kind of closure, it stays with them. It becomes part of the silence, because in their quiet moments, they know exactly what they lost. Not just a relationship, but a chance to become someone who doesn't have to hide anymore. The mirror they couldn't bear to look into. You never said anything cruel. You never raised your voice. You never humiliated them or belittled their flaws or made their past a weapon. But what you did, without even realizing, was hold up a mirror. And that mirror didn't reflect your love alone. It reflected the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. You didn't force change on them. You simply existed in truth. And sometimes, that's the most terrifying thing of all. You didn't attack them. You didn't confront them with ultimatums. But your presence, your energy, your clarity, it made it impossible for them to keep hiding. They saw themselves in your eyes. And for a moment, a fleeting, uncomfortable, soul-wrenching moment, they couldn't lie. Not to you, and not to themselves. You didn't come into their life to expose them, but your love revealed them. And if you've ever known someone who's built their life on performance, on avoidance, on compartmentalization, you'll understand this. To be revealed feels like death, not to the soul, but to the persona, because everything they used to survive, the masks, the stories, the strategies, start to crack under the light of genuine connection. You didn't ask for the role of mirror. You just played it by showing up in authenticity. When you listened instead of accused. When you held space instead of controlled. When you stayed grounded while they spiraled. You were the reflection they couldn't fake their way through. And suddenly, their whole identity, the one built to keep people from ever seeing too deeply, was in danger. Because for the first time, someone wasn't reacting to the version of them they curated. You were responding to the one they were. That's why they felt naked around you. That's why they'd get uncomfortable when you'd quietly observe, instead of fill the silence. That's why they'd change the subject when things got too still, too quiet, too intimate. Not because you were intense, but because you were real. And real is unbearable to someone who survives on illusions. You have to understand, they've worn their mask for so long. They forgot it wasn't skin. To remove it now would mean grieving the years they spent hiding. It would mean admitting the loneliness was self-imposed. It would mean taking responsibility, not just for their choices, but for the ways they hurt others while running from themselves. They didn't want that reckoning. So they ran from the one person who held the key to it. You. Because you didn't chase. You didn't beg. You didn't demand they be better. You just were better. And that's where the mirror became unbearable. You see, the people who are most terrified of being truly seen are often the same ones who long for deep connection. It's not that they don't want love. It's that they fear what love demands from them. Not performance, not perfection, but presence. And presence requires them to be where they've never been, in their own hearts, with their own pain, with no escape hatch. So when they found you and felt the safety of someone who doesn't need to dominate, but simply knows who they are, they panicked. You weren't like the others. You weren't trying to manipulate them. You weren't trying to fix them. You weren't even trying to keep them. You were just being. And that stillness, That quiet power unraveled every defense they'd built. Because it's hard to lie to someone who isn't afraid of your truth. And it's terrifying to realize they might love you despite it. That's where the shame kicks in. The internal war, the regression, the sabotage. You didn't break them. They were already broken. You just illuminated the fractures. And when someone spent their whole life trying to cover their cracks, the one who dares to see them clearly becomes both a sanctuary and a threat. That's why you confused them, because you didn't need them, but you chose them. And that choice forced them to look at themselves, to ask, why would someone so whole want someone like me? That question is dangerous, because to answer it, they'd have to admit they're not irredeemable. They'd have to try. And trying means risking failure. Trying means being vulnerable. Trying means surrendering the story that says they're unlovable. A story that, while painful, has at least kept them safe in their isolation. You, just by existing, threatened that narrative. You were the first person who made them think, maybe I'm not too much. Maybe I'm not broken beyond repair. Maybe I'm not impossible to love after all. But hope is terrifying to the hopeless, because if it's real, they can lose it. So they ran from the only mirror that didn't distort their reflection. The only mirror that reflected not just who they were, but who they could be. And maybe one day, they'll come back. Not for closure, not out of regret, but because they finally saw in themselves what you saw all along. But until that day comes, if it ever does, you need to understand this. Their running wasn't about your worth. It was about their refusal to stand still long enough to see it. The disappearing act was never about you. They didn't disappear because you did something wrong. They disappeared because you did something right. Something too right. You saw them, not the version they rehearsed, not the mask they wore with friends, not the filtered one they used online. You saw the version of them they swore they'd keep hidden forever. That's what did it. They weren't afraid of being unloved. They were afraid of being loved where they were still broken. And when you reached for that part with gentleness instead of judgment, they couldn't process it. You didn't just knock on the door they bolted shut. You waited outside it with compassion, warmth, and terrifying steadiness. That's what made them run. Not your intensity, not your expectations, not your love, but your consistency. Because that's what they've never known. Because that's what makes their old survival strategies obsolete. And without those, they don't know who they are. See, there's a myth that avoidance run because they don't care, that they ghost because they're selfish, that they disappear because they never loved you. But what if I told you it was the opposite? What if their disappearance was an act of emotional preservation? What if it was them trying to save themselves from the person who finally gave them a glimpse of everything they thought they weren't worthy of? They didn't leave because you exposed them. They left because you woke them. And waking someone who's lived inside emotional anesthesia, who's learned to survive by numbing, distracting, withdrawing, is not a neutral act. It's revolutionary. It's intrusive in the most tender way, like light suddenly flooding into a dark room where someone's been sleeping for years. And yes, the light is beautiful, but it also hurts. You touch the one place they buried, the place their mother or father or first heartbreak taught them was too much, the place they were taught to abandon so they could be lovable, the place they were told, you're only safe if no one ever sees this. But you saw it. And worse, you stayed. And even worse than that, you loved it. That is why they ran. Because to let that love in would mean confronting every lie their trauma told them. It would mean admitting their pain was real, and that their healing now demands more than just silence and avoidance. You, unknowingly, became the moment their defense system couldn't outrun. You cracked the shell not by force, but by sitting still long enough that their armor mistook you for safety. And then came the panic. The kind of panic that doesn't show up with screaming. The kind that shows up with slow replies. Emotional flatlines. One-word texts. I'm just going through a lot. I think I need space. I'm not ready for this. But don't confuse distance with disinterest. They didn't ghost you to hurt you. They ghosted you because they were terrified to love you back in full. Because loving you would require them to come home to parts of themselves they've long abandoned. You didn't fail. You didn't misread the signs. You didn't push too hard. You simply stayed long enough for their mask to slip. And when it did, they realized. You weren't loving who they pretended to be. You were loving them. And that was unbearable. Here's what no one tells you about love and trauma. The closer you get to real intimacy, the louder the old wounds scream. Not because intimacy is dangerous, but because the wound was never healed. It just had a lid on it. A lid you accidentally lifted with your tenderness. They didn't know how to explain that, so they left. And it's okay to grieve that. It's okay to feel discarded. It's okay to wonder if it meant nothing. But here's the truth. It did mean something. And that's why they ran. Because if you were just another fling, another surface-level connection, they could have stayed numb. They could have kept the story going. They could have maintained control. But you made them feel something too real to compartmentalize. Too big to stuff back down. Too safe to stay guarded. And for a heart that's used to surviving, that kind of safety can feel like danger. So they ran, not because you were unsafe, but because you were safe in a way they weren't ready for. Let that be your closure. They didn't disappear because you were too much. They disappeared because, for the first time, they almost let themselves be enough. And maybe one day, they'll stop running. Maybe they'll wake up to the echo of your presence and realize they weren't afraid of you. They were afraid of healing. And maybe that day won't come. But whether it does or doesn't, you need to know this. You weren't left because you failed. You were left because your love reached farther than they were ready to go. And that's not rejection. That's revelation. Let it be the moment you stop running too. From your worth, your depth, your capacity to hold love without shrinking. Because if you could touch what they buried, imagine what you'll find with someone willing to be found. If this reached somewhere deep in you, share it. Send it to the one friend who's still healing from the silence. The one who needed love to mean something more. And if you're still trying to make sense of why they left, subscribe. There's more coming. Not to fix what broke, but to help you rise stronger from where it cracked. Because the way you love deserves not to be buried, but witnessed.